Hey there, everybody. Welcome to our live class all about teaching letter sounds and letter names in a way that our kids will remember them. This has been a challenge, I know, for several people in the group, and it's a really common challenge that comes up as we're teaching our kids to read, and we're helping them to be able to remember the letter sounds or the letter names over time. And so I want to talk today about some strategies for how to do that. I'm going to double check and make sure that everybody is working and that everything is streaming in all the places that it should be. If you can see and hear me, please say hey in the comments wherever you're watching this video and let me know that things are working and that you are here. And if you are watching the replay, please say hey wherever you're watching the replay in the comments and let me know that you're here watching the replay as well. It looks like, yep, awesome. It looks like things are working. Good deal. All right. So I am so excited about this topic today because this is one of the most common challenges that happens when we're teaching our kids how to read. We teach them a new letter sound or a new letter name. We work so hard to practice it. We think for sure they've got it. They think for sure they've got it. And then we come back to it the very next day and our kid is like a deer in headlights and they have no clue what they learned the day before. This is so common and it happens a lot to a lot of us. Oh, yay. I'm so glad it's working. Hey, thanks for watching. Awesome. Okay. So, if it's happening to you, I just want you to know, first of all, that you are not alone and that your child is not broken. We're going to talk today about why this happens for our kids. And we're also going to talk about some strategies that we can use as we're teaching those letter names and letter sounds to try to help them stick a little bit better. So I want to jump right in and we're going to start by talking about why it happens and about that process of learning letter names and letter sounds. Because I think if we get nerdy and talk about some of the science of reading and how our brains work for just a couple minutes, that will help us not only understand this process better as teachers, but also have a little bit more compassion for our kids as they're going through the process of learning. And I think one of the really key distinctions here to understand is the difference between teaching a skill and memorizing a fact. So, reading, the process of reading and sounding out a word is a skill. And that's something that once you learn it, it clicks and you've got it forever. So, a skill is kind of like riding a bike. If you think back to when you were a kid and you first learned how to ride a bike, that struggle of like figuring out how to balance, and maybe you had training wheels or a balance bike, and then one day you got it and it clicked, right? And then even if you don't ride a bike for maybe 5 or 10 or 20 years, or maybe you haven't ridden a bike since you were a kid, if you were to get back up on a bike today, you would still have that skill, right? You would still be able to balance because it's a skill and it clicked for you. And the great news for us is that being able to sound out those words is also a skill, and that at some point that's going to click for our kids. And when it does, they're going to have that skill, and we're not going to need to go back and review. Okay, you start with this letter sound, and then you put this letter sound next, and then this one at the end, right? As adults, we don't have to do that. And even if we don't read for a period of time, or if we aren't people that read a lot for fun, we still have that skill. It doesn't go away. The problem is that the letter names and the letter sounds are not part of that skill. They're actually facts that have to be memorized. And whenever we're memorizing a fact, we not only have to repeat it a lot to get it to stick in our brain, but we also have to repeat it over time and review it in order to keep it there. So if you think about maybe learning a foreign language, I know I took Spanish when I was in high school. I took 3 years of Spanish and I learned a ton of vocabulary words in Spanish. And I remember having these thick stacks of flashcards of all of these Spanish words that I was trying to learn and memorize. And then the final exam would come up and I'd have to go back and review all of the flashcards from all of the stacks again, because even the ones that I learned at the very beginning, I still had to keep reviewing and working on them in order to keep it in my memory. And maybe you can relate to that if you've ever taken a language or tried to learn another subject like that that had a lot of facts to learn. And when our kids are learning those letter names and letter sounds, those are facts for them that they have to memorize. So it's not something where once they understand that M says, they're going to have that forever. That's something where they will need to review that over time in order to keep it fresh in their memory. So the good news is that once we get that skill of reading to click, they'll have all of that review as they're reading the words. but we just need to keep that in mind as we're going. So that begs the question then, right? How many times do we need to practice these crazy letter sounds before they stick, right? And the reality is that that's going to depend on the child, but in general, it's probably a lot more times than you think. For some kids, it might be 3 or 4 or 5 repetitions, all the way up to some kids are going to need hundreds and hundreds of exposures to each letter sound in order to get that to transfer into their long-term memory. And this is especially true for kids with dyslexia or with working memory challenges. So, like any kind of ADHD tends to come with working memory challenges. And so, if your child has a diagnosis like that, or if you suspect one, then it's possible that your child might be further along on the spectrum, closer to the needing hundreds of repetitions versus needing just a few. And that is totally normal as well. Okay, so let's talk as well about the process of how this actually happens, how these repetitions translate into learning, because I think this will also help us as we're talking about what to do and how to teach. So, we have inside of our brains a process called phonological memory. And so, what happens is the brain is remembering in its working memory the sounds that we're teaching our kids. And so, if we kind of really think about that process and break it down, it's actually got a lot more steps than you think. If you're trying to teach the letter sound for M, then first your child has to be able to hear the so there's a hearing component of it, and they need to be able to hear the sound correctly, the way that you've pronounced it. And then they have to be able to hold that sound in their working memory. So their brain has to remember which actually is a really abstract concept if you think about it, but they have to remember that sound. And then they have to hold that sound in their working memory long enough to do something with it, to match it up to the letter, for example, or maybe to blend it into a word if we're more advanced here. And then eventually they have to transfer that sound from their short-term memory into their long-term memory. And the challenge is that if kids struggle with working memory, or if the connection that we're making there is weaker, then the sound can kind of drop out before that connection into long-term memory forms. So the research says that about 10% of kids overall struggle with this phonological memory. But if a child has a learning disability like dyslexia, about 20 to 50% of the kids that have that are going to struggle with this phonological memory. And so it's really important as we're teaching them that we're just aware of this, that we're resetting our expectations to think, okay, maybe this is a little bit more of a process than we thought it was, and that we're coming at it really strategically with strategies that are going to make it easier for them. So let's talk about some of those strategies. Let's get super practical here. And I want to share 3 strategies today that I always try to use whenever I'm teaching facts to my kids, and strategies that will help make this process of transferring those sounds into long-term memory happen faster. So the first strategy here is called spaced repetition or spaced retrieval. And this basically means that instead of one big cram session, that you're going to spread it out and do it a lot of times over time. So there have been a bunch of different studies done on this, and basically the gist of all of them is that they will have one group of kids or adults or whoever, and they'll teach them something like all at once in a big session, and then the other ones they'll spread it out and teach them, like instead of 3 hours at once, they might do 30 minutes a day for 6 days. So they're getting the same amount of time of practicing, but it's either spaced out or all at once. And they consistently find in these kinds of studies that whenever you space it out, that it works better, that the kids remember better, that long-term memory is better. So the idea here is that you want to practice it a lot of times, even if it's just for a few minutes, and you want to put time in between each of those practices so that it's not like fresh in their brain. They haven't just done it. You're waiting a minute and then coming back to it again. And I think for us as homeschool parents, this is actually really great news, because it's easier to do the spaced repetitions as long as you structure it right than it is to do the one giant cram session anyway, right? Like, I don't know who has 3 hours to sit down and teach their child how to read. But I know that's not my reality, right? If you've got other kids or other responsibilities other than teaching your child to read, it's going to be really hard to find that long period of time. But if you're just trying to fit in a 5-minute review session, that's a lot easier to do. So I've been working on this with my kids right now with speech. We've been trying to help them improve a few of their speech sounds that didn't develop as quickly as we would have liked them to. And now that they're older, we're realizing that we need a little bit of speech therapy in order to help those sounds fully develop. And so once a week, we go to speech, and my child sits down with the speech therapist, and they have a very focused session where for an hour, they're trying to get them to say the sound as many times as possible. And often the speech therapist is counting in the notebook, and she's keeping little tally marks of how many times my child says that sound. And that is fantastic and great. But then when we go home, we do speech practice differently. So we have a homework assignment that we do, and we actually keep our homework assignment in the car. And so then every day when we're out running errands, or when I'm driving my child to an activity or to church or wherever it is that we're going, during the time that we're already in the car, we're practicing those speech sounds. And we're not going to get an hour in. I don't have a notebook. I don't keep track of tallies. I'm not doing any of that. But the advantage that I do have there is that we're practicing this every day, even just for a couple of minutes. And sometimes we'll do it on the way there, and then we'll do it again on the way back. So we have two different spaced repetitions for these same speech sounds in the same day. And because we're able to do that every day, sometimes twice, because we go there and we go back, we're getting in like 12 different practice sessions over the space of those 6 days in between one speech session to the next. And so the value there is not that we spent hours and hours, not that I drilled it, but just that we're doing it and we're coming back to it consistently. So the big trick with this is to figure out what other routine in your day you're going to pair this with. Maybe every time your child eats a meal, you put a little sheet of words at the table and you're practicing those letter sounds right at the beginning or the end of your meal. Or maybe you're going to tie it to bedtime and you do it first thing in the morning and last time at night. So you put a little list right next to your child's bed. There are lots of different ways that you can do it, but if you can anchor it into your day at a specific time and have that trigger that happens that lets you know that it's time to practice those letter sounds, that's a really great way. You can also write letter sounds on sticky notes and put them up around your house. And then just every time you pass them, that'll be a trigger as well to remind you to practice. So maybe if you're working on M, maybe you've got 3 different sticky notes with M's on them at different points in the house. And whenever you pass one, you point to it and ask your child what letter that is. So these are all strategies that are giving you these spaced repetitions, spaced retrievals, so that your child has lots of opportunities to remember that thing at different points during the day when it's not fresh. Okay, so we talked about how you can cycle back to the letters, and you want to make sure that you're continuing to review the letters, especially the ones that your child doesn't know, over time. Okay, so second strategy here is going to be using multisensory activities teaching. And this one I love because they've actually studied this with kindergartners who were learning letter sounds. And they had 2 different groups. And basically they found that the kids who did activities that had different multisensory components learned the sounds better than the kids who just did like traditional boring lessons. So whenever we're teaching a new fact, a new letter sound, or a letter name, we want to make sure that we include as many different multisensory components as possible. So for me, what I'm always trying to think is I want my child to have something to see, something to hear, and something to either feel or do. So there's 3 different ones. I try to include all 3 as many times as I can, and it's not as hard as it seems, but you want something to see, something to hear, and something to feel or do. Okay, so something to see is going to be your visual component. So that's probably going to be the letter itself. Maybe you've got letter flashcards that you're working on. Maybe you've got a book where you've written, where you're like pointing to the different letters. Maybe you're going to get a giant piece of paper or even just a regular piece of paper and put it on your wall, and there's the letter. Anything like that where they can see the letter is helpful. You might even have them write the letter, which is something to see and something to do, right? So some of these kind of have some overlap. You also want them to have something to hear. So that would be the letter sound probably, and maybe you're saying it, or maybe they're saying it, or maybe both. And you could incorporate that into a song or a game, or it could just be every time you see the letter, you say the letter, those kinds of things. And then something to feel or do is a fun one. So the feel might be maybe they're feeling the letter itself. Maybe you have a set of magnetic letters that are shaped like the letter and they can feel the letter. Maybe you're tracing the letter in sand or in a salt tray. Maybe you're building the letter out of Play-Doh or kinetic sand. Maybe you're writing it in shaving cream. Maybe you're using pipe cleaners and building the letter. There are so many options here. Or maybe it's something to do. Maybe you're having them write the letter really big using their whole arm. Or maybe you're having them jump up and down while they say the letter. Ideally, it's related to the letter in some way, but it could even just be we're going to run down to the end of the hallway, grab a letter, say it, and then run back to the other end of the hallway. Just something to keep them busy and moving is helpful. And whenever we do this, we're engaging more different parts of their brain in this process, which is really the key to it. Because the more parts of the brain that we can engage, the more it's like having different roads to kind of lead to the same destination, and helps them be able to learn it better and remember it more. So that was the second one, is multisensory, something to see, something to hear, and something to feel or do. And then the last strategy is application. And this one is just as soon as possible, we want them to understand why it is that we're asking them to learn all of these letter sounds. Because when we're learning something on purpose for a purpose that matters to us, we tend to learn it better. I've used this strategy before, so if you've been around, you might be familiar with it. But my favorite strategy for talking about this is to think about cars, because I'm not a car person in general. I'm not really interested in cars other than to the extent that they have four wheels and will get me wherever I need to go. There's where my interest ends, right? And there are different kinds of cars, and I really don't care, honestly. However, whenever we need a new car, all of a sudden I care. So last fall, my husband's car that has 70,000 miles on it, its transmission died, and we weren't expecting that. And so now we have a car and a paperweight, and we're in the market for a car. And so I'm researching like new cars, used cars. Do we want a car? Are we going to get something bigger? Like, what are we going to do with this? And all of a sudden, I am very interested in cars. So as we're driving by on the road, I'm starting to notice different brands of cars. And as we're out researching, or I'm out on the internet, I'm starting to search for and look at cars and watch videos about cars. And I signed up for a subscription to compare different cars to each other so that I could do all of this research. And I cared zero about cars before this, but now all of a sudden, because it matters to me, I'm researching it and I'm interested and I'm learning things. And I could have gone out and done that research before, but I know that it wouldn't have stuck as well as it is now, because that information is important and something that I need. And maybe you can relate to that. Maybe there's something that you either are really interested in now but weren't before, or maybe something that you had that period of time that you can think back on where you really needed that information, and then all of a sudden you researched and got interested. And our kids are no different. They also go through periods of time where they become more interested in some things than others. And if you think about your kids, you can probably tell what their topics are right now. Right? Like those are the two or three things that if you ask them to talk about it, they could go on for 20 minutes without taking a breath. Right? And they know so much about this topic. For my son right now, it's Pokemon, and it's so fascinating because he can tell you the names of all of them and their evolutions and their different characteristics, and it's just so interesting to talk to him about that topic, because you can tell that he's so interested in it, and the amount of information that he has memorized about these different Pokemon is just insane. But anyway, when something is important to us, we learn it better. And so bringing it back to the letters, if we can help our kids see that we can use these letters to make words, and we can use those words to read stories, then we can help them to see why learning those letters is important to them. And so if we can give them the letters in the context of words. And if we can give them those words in the context of like a side-by-side story, for example, then we can help them to see what they are working towards. So as soon as your child can blend enough sounds to be able to, or knows enough sounds to be able to blend and make a word, I recommend starting with that process of blending and making words too, so that they can start to use those sounds that they've learned. And that will help them as well with learning and remembering them. Okay, if you have questions about this, feel free to put them in the chat wherever you're watching the video. And if you're watching the replay, please feel free to drop questions in the replay as well. And I will try to come back and make sure that those get answered. Okay, one of the most common questions that I get about this is specifically surrounding dyslexia. So I want to make sure that I just kind of talk about that for a minute, because really the thing that happens with dyslexia is that this process is just a little bit less automatic. So these kids often are going to be further on the spectrum of needing more repetitions in order to make these sounds a part of their long-term memory. So they might have challenges with that phonological memory that we talked about earlier, and just need more repetitions. And so when we're working with a child that is struggling with this, the first thing that we need to make sure that we do is just expect that it's going to take longer. So if it's only been 5 or 10 or 20 repetitions and they're still not getting it, that's not a time to get frustrated. That's just a time to recognize that we need a little bit more practice with this. So we want to make sure, again, that we're using those strategies, multi-sensory and using the spaced repetitions, lots of different practices, and then also giving them the application. We want to make sure that we're doing all of those things, even just a little bit more intensively. And then we want to continue to celebrate as they're making progress. I was hearing about this really interesting study yesterday that basically said that when kids learn something new, or when the brain learns something new, that not only does it change the neuron that it's directly impacted to, but also the ones around it also start to change. And so the more that we're learning, and the more that our brain is changing, the more that it like primes our brain for additional learning and additional change. I thought that was so cool. Our brains are amazing. Okay, so we can celebrate progress because we know that more progress will lead to more progress as well. Okay, so things not to do. We don't want to get frustrated. Or even if we are frustrated, we want to try to keep that under wraps a little bit, because chances are our kids are frustrated too, right? So we want to make sure that we are having realistic expectations and trying to be patient with them as much as we can. We also want to not add all of the letters all at once. So if our kids are really struggling, variety is not necessarily going to be the best. We also don't want to wait for all of the letters before we start to apply. So if kids are really struggling with this and they're really struggling with remembering the letters and it's taking forever, we do want to also work on blending alongside so that they'll start to have that application piece, and so that we can start working on blending. And then also we don't want to compare. It's so easy to compare our kids to others, right? But every child is on their own reading journey, and that is totally okay. Kelly says, should we start with a few letters and have them master them before moving on to the rest, or introduce all the letters and practice a few a day? Yeah, I would definitely start with just a few, Kelly. I like to start with about 4 to 6, but that will depend also on your child's age. So if they're kind of on the younger side of things, like 2, 3, age 2 or 3, or maybe even 4, I would be closer to the 4 letters side of things. And if they're older, 6 or 7, age 6 or 7, then maybe do more like 6 or 7 letters. So maybe even you could do as many letters as their age. But yeah, I would introduce them in a group. And one of the reasons for that is that you can sort of start to do some comparisons of the letters to each other. And you can play games with them, right? So if you put all the letters in a pile, then you can say, show me the letter that says, and then they have 2 or 3 letters to choose from, right? So yeah, I would definitely start with a small group. And then once they're feeling pretty confident with that small group, then you can add a second small group of the same size. So like if you started with 4, then add 4 more, and then you're going to review all 8. and then add another 4, and then review all 12. So you're working in small groups. The other thing to know about your groups when you're choosing is you want to be careful not to choose letters that can be commonly confused in the same group. So if you're doing lowercase letters, you never want to put B and D in the same group. And then also don't put P or Q in that group. So anything that you could like turn or rotate or whatever and make it be the same letter, don't put those together. So kind of split those up. But yeah, I would start with just a few. You can also start with the letters in your child's name. That's a really great place to start because a lot of times they know those and they're familiar with them. And so that gives them a quick win. Or start with really common letters. Yeah. Hopefully that helped. Let me know if you've got follow-up questions for sure. Okay, so going forward from here, this week, your job is to pick one of those strategies to start with and try to apply as you're teaching these letters. So you could start with the spaced practices and figure out when during your day you're going to start to implement those practice sessions so that you get 1 to 2 5-minute practice sessions every day. Again, it doesn't have to be long, just a few minutes is plenty, especially with younger kids. And you just want to find a time that's consistent. And so choosing an activity that already happens consistently every day, like maybe when your kids get dressed or when they brush their teeth or when you feed the dog, something that you already do every day that you won't forget, and then doing your reading practice right before or right after that so that you're building in that schedule. So that's one option. Another option is working on making it multisensory. So making sure that every lesson or every activity that you do has something to see, something to hear, and something to do or feel for your child. So again, that can be just looking at the letter, saying it out loud, and then skywriting it or writing it with chalk or any of those doing or feeling activities that we talked about. If you're stuck, feel free to put that in the group and we can all brainstorm activities. That would be very fun to do. Or then maybe it's applying. So maybe you're taking the letter sounds that your child already knows and starting the process of teaching them to read with those letter sounds. So choose one of those to do this week and try to concentrate on making that a part of your reading practice with your child. And then, of course, keep track of how it's going. Keep track of maybe you're going to count repetitions, maybe you're not. Maybe you're just going to celebrate with them as they make improvement and start to remember. And then just remember to be patient, that it takes longer than we think most of the time. Kelly says, thanks, that's great. Okay, good. Awesome. Yeah, if you have another question or comment, feel free to drop those wherever you're watching the video. I am going to try to do another one of these, I think, next week. So I would love to know also what you would like to learn about or what we can talk about in the group. So feel free to drop questions in the group or here in the comments wherever you're watching the video, and we'll plan some topics for the next few weeks and try to do a few more classes and see if we can learn about some more stuff. All right, thank you so much for watching, everybody. Again, feel free to ask questions in the comments or I will see you in the group as well. Feel free to share wins in the group too if this was helpful, or let me know how it goes when you try the activities this week. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. Bye.